The smell of stale coffee and fried bacon hung thick in the air at the farmer's table, a smell as permanent as the cracked linoleum floor and the sun-faded Coca-Cola sign in the window. It was the spring of '72, and the talk was all about planting. For Silas Blackwood, sitting alone in a booth by the window, the talk was a dull roar in the background. His mind was on the sheared-off bolt head for the hydraulic pump on his John Deere 4010. The parts man in town had to order it. 2 days, maybe 3. 2 or 3 days of sunshine he couldn't afford to lose. He was stirring his third cup of coffee when the screen door slammed shut, letting in a slice of bright April air and Richard Sterling. Sterling wasn't a farmer, not in the way Silas's father or grandfather had been. Sterling was an investor from the city who'd bought the old Miller place 2 years back, bulldozed the historic barn for a new Morton building, and filled it with brand-new, fire-engine-red International Harvester equipment. He didn't wear work boots. He wore polished loafers. His hands were soft. Sterling held court at the big round table in the middle of the diner, his voice booming over the quiet conversations of the other men. He was with the bank manager, Mr. Abernathy, and a couple of other younger farmers who were following his lead, leveraging their land to buy bigger and better. "Gentlemen," Sterling announced, loud enough for the whole room to hear, "the future is now. You can't make money pinching pennies. You've got to spend money to make money." He took a sip of his water, his eyes scanning the room before they landed on Silas. A slick, knowing smile spread across his face. "Take old Silas over there," Sterling said, gesturing with his fork. A few heads turned. Silas kept his eyes on his coffee cup, feeling the heat rise in his neck. Still trying to scratch a living out of the dirt with that old museum piece. "What is that thing, Silas? A 4010? Saw you pulled over on the County Line Road yesterday. Looked like you were having a séance with it, smoke pouring out of it like a steam engine." A few nervous chuckles rippled from Sterling's table. Mr. Abernathy, the banker, had the decency to look down at his plate, but the smirk was still there. "I told him last year," Sterling continued, his voice dripping with condescension, "Silas, let the bank help you. Trade that relic in on a new 1066. It's got a cab, air conditioning, a radio. You wouldn't have to eat dust all day." But no, he'd rather wrench on that old junker than make a decent living. Silas slowly placed his spoon on the saucer. The clink of metal on ceramic seemed impossibly loud in the suddenly quiet diner. He didn't look up. He just pictured the lines of his own ledger book at home. Every page was written in black ink. The farm, the house, the equipment, every last nut and bolt was his. He owed no man a dime. That was a piece Richard Sterling, with his mountain of banknotes and his shiny loafers, would never understand. It was a lesson beaten into the Blackwood family by the dust and desperation of the 1930s. His father, a man who'd seen neighbors lose everything, had one piece of advice, a commandment Silas lived by. "If you can't pay for it with the cash in your pocket, son, you can't afford it." Sterling and his friends moved on to other topics: land prices, interest rates, the new four-wheel drive tractors that were coming out. Silas finished his coffee, left $3 on the table for his $2 meal, and walked out without a word. The screen door creaked shut behind him, leaving the smell of bacon and arrogance in his wake. His 1965 Ford F-100 coughed to life on the second try, the familiar rumble of its straight-six engine a comforting sound. The truck was like everything else he owned, old, paid for, and maintained with his own 2 hands. The cab smelled of oil, soil, and the faint scent of the pipe tobacco his father used to smoke. There were dents in the fenders from runaway fence posts, and a patch of Bondo on the passenger door from a misjudgment with a gate. But it ran. It always ran. Back at the farm, The 4010 sat silent and wounded in the driveway of the machine shed, a dark stain of hydraulic fluid spreading on the gravel beneath it. It wasn't just a tractor to Silas. His father had bought it used in '64, the year before he passed. It was the first big tractor on their place, a symbol of hope and progress after years of making do with their old Farmall M. Silas had spent more hours in that cracked vinyl seat than he had in his own bed. He knew its every groan, every vibration. He knew the precise spot on the throttle where the diesel engine found its sweet spot, that perfect hum of power and efficiency. He'd rebuilt the engine himself 5 years ago, replacing the sleeves and pistons on the floor of this very shed. He'd rewired it, patched its tires, and welded its loader bucket more times than he could count. Now, before we get too deep into the grease and grit of Silas's workshop, I want to ask you all something. Have you ever known a man like that? A man who would rather spend a week rebuilding a transmission with his own 2 hands than sign a piece of paper at the bank? A man who saw debt not as a tool but as a chain? Let me know in the comments below, because men like Silas are a dying breed, and their stories need to be told. The truth was, Sterling's words had stung more than he let on. Not because he thought Sterling was right, but because he knew how the rest of the county saw him. A stubborn fool, a relic, a man being left behind by the march of progress. But as Silas looked at his silent green tractor, he didn't see a relic. He saw freedom. He saw a machine that, with enough sweat and patience, he could bring back to life without asking for anyone's permission or money. And in the spring of 1972, with the promise of easy credit whispering in every farmer's ear, the kind of freedom was becoming a rare and precious thing. The next 2 days were a blur of grease and frustration. Silas rigged a chain hoist to a heavy beam in the machine shed, the metal links groaning as he carefully lifted the heavy pump assembly away from the tractor's belly. Hydraulic fluid, thick and red like blood, dripped onto the oil-soaked concrete floor. He worked by the light of a single bare bulb hanging from a cord, the shadows making the complex guts of the machine a confusing maze of hoses and fittings. He laid the parts out on a clean workbench, piece by piece, in the exact order he removed them. He used a can of kerosene and a stiff brush to clean away decades of caked-on grime, revealing the worn, gleaming metal beneath. He found the problem soon enough. The main bearing had seized, causing the input shaft to shear clean off. It was a catastrophic failure, and it explained the high-pitched whine he'd heard just before the steering and hydraulics went dead in the field. While he waited for the new parts to arrive, he didn't rest. He pulled out the old Farmall M, the tractor he'd learned to drive on as a boy. Its narrow front end and simple, rugged design felt ancient compared to the 4010, but the engine fired up with a familiar, throaty roar. He hooked it to the 4-row planter. It was slow work. The M didn't have the horsepower to pull the planter as fast as the Deer, and without live hydraulics, he had to stop and use the cumbersome lift lever at the end of every row. From his fields, which bordered the county road, he could see his neighbors. Tom Henderson roared past in a brand-new John Deere 4430, its enclosed cab a silent bubble of comfort, the radio probably playing the latest Johnny Cash hit. He was pulling an 8-row planter, covering twice the ground in half the time. Tom gave Silas a short, almost pitying wave, and Silas lifted a greasy hand in return. Later in the afternoon, Sterling's new UT 666 thundered by on its way to another field he'd just leased, its dual rear wheels kicking up clouds of dust. Sterling didn't even look his way. The talk at the co-op grain elevator, where he went to get a bag of seed corn, was no better. The men stood around the office, drinking burnt coffee from styrofoam cups, and the conversation was all about Sterling's latest expansion. "Heard he paid top dollar for the old Johnson place," one man said, shaking his head in a mixture of awe and disbelief. "Well, the bank's backing him all the way," another added. "Abernathy says land values are only going up. Says in 5 years we'll all be millionaires." When Silas walked in, the conversation faltered. They looked at his grease-stained overalls and the worried lines on his face. "Having some trouble, Silas?" the elevator manager asked, his tone carefully neutral. "Pump went out on the 4010, Silas said, hoisting the seed bag onto his shoulder. "Got the M on the planter for now." An awkward silence fell over the group. Using a Farmall M to plant corn in 1972 was like using a horse and plough. It was a confession of poverty, a sign that you were falling behind. One of the younger farmers, emboldened by Sterling's example, couldn't help but smirk. "Should have traded that thing in when you had the chance, Silas. A man can't get ahead with antiques." Silas didn't reply. He just paid for his seed in cash, nodded to the men, and left. Driving home, he gripped the steering wheel of his old truck until his knuckles were white. It wasn't just the breakdown. It was the feeling of being an island, of watching the entire world rush past him toward a future built on paper promises and bankers' handshakes. His wife, Mary, saw the strain on his face that evening at the dinner table. "You're working too hard," she said softly, placing a hand on his arm. "You're going to run yourself into the ground." "The work's got to get done, Mary," he said, staring at his plate. "The corn doesn't wait for parts to come in." Maybe Mr. Sterling is right," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Maybe it's time we thought about a newer tractor. Just a small loan." Silas looked up, and the hurt in his eyes silenced her. "We don't take loans, Mary. We don't owe anybody. That's worth more than any new tractor. My father didn't lose this place in the Depression, and I'm not going to lose it in the good times." He pushed his chair back and went back out to the shed, where he worked late into the night, cleaning and preparing the surfaces for the new pump. The lonely glow of the single light bulb, a beacon of stubborn defiance against the encroaching darkness. The new parts finally arrived on a Friday. Silas spent the entire weekend painstakingly reassembling the hydraulic system. It was a delicate, frustrating job. He pinched an O-ring on the first try and had to drain 10 gallons of fresh, expensive high-guard fluid to replace it. He cursed, threw a wrench against the wall, and then took a deep breath and started over. Finally, on Sunday evening, as the sun bled orange and purple across the western sky, he tightened the last bolt. He climbed into the seat, turned the key, and pushed the starter button. The diesel engine cranked, coughed a puff of black smoke, and then settled into its familiar, powerful rhythm. Silas engaged the hydraulic lever. The loader arms, which had been sagging lifelessly, rose smoothly and powerfully toward the rafters of the shed. A slow smile spread across his face. It was a victory, a small one, in a long and quiet war, but a victory nonetheless. He had faced the breakdown, endured the scorn, and brought his machine back to life with his own skill and his own 2 hands. He was a week behind on planting, but he was still his own man. The years that followed seemed to prove Silas wrong and Richard Sterling right. The mid-1970s arrived like a fever dream for the American farmer. Following President Nixon's grain deal with the Soviet Union, commodity prices shot into the stratosphere. Corn went from $1.50 a bushel to $3, then $3.50. Soybeans doubled. The government, led by Secretary of Agriculture Earl Boots, had a simple, intoxicating message: get big or get out. Farmers were encouraged to plant fence row to fence row, to borrow, to expand, to feed a hungry world. Land that had been selling for $500 an acre was suddenly worth $2,000, then $3,000. It was a gold rush, and Rick Sterling was its king. He used the skyrocketing value of his land as collateral for ever larger loans. He bought the 160 acres to his north, then the 80 to his east. He tore out old fences and waterways, creating vast, efficient fields. His operation became a showcase of modern agriculture. He traded his 1066 for a massive international harvester, 1466. Its turbocharged engine, a guttural roar that could be heard a mile away. Soon after, a brand new, articulated Steiger Panther 4-wheel drive appeared in his yard, a green monster capable of pulling a 12-bottom plow through the earth like a hot knife through butter. He built a gleaming new grain setup with a leg elevator and 3 50,000-bushel bins, dwarfing the old wooden cribs on his neighbors' farms. He drove a new Lincoln Continental every 2 years and took winter vacations in Florida. At the diner, his mockery of Silas softened into a kind of patronizing pity. "Poor Silas," he'd say to Mr. Abernathy, who was now his constant companion. "He's sitting on a gold mine and doesn't even know it. His farm is paid for. He could borrow $500,000 tomorrow, triple his operation. Instead, he's out there patching tires on that old Gleaner combine. Some men are just afraid of success." The pressure on Silas was immense. It came from all sides. The farm equipment dealers sent him glossy brochures of new machines. The seed salesman talked about the yields his neighbors were getting with their new, bigger planters. Even the banker, Mr. Abernathy, made a special trip out to the farm one afternoon. He pulled up in his Buick, got out, and leaned against the fence, watching Silas grease the fittings on his old John Deere. "Silas," Abernathy said, getting straight to the point, "the bank's prepared to offer you a very generous line of credit. Interest rates are manageable, and with land values what they are, there's no risk. You could buy that quarter section next to you that's coming up for sale. Get yourself a new combine. You deserve it. You've worked hard." Silas wiped his hands on a red rag, his movements slow and deliberate. He looked at his fields, neat and well-tended. He looked at his machinery, old but immaculate. He thought of his savings account at the little credit union in the next town over, an account Abernathy knew nothing about. The high grain prices had been good to him too. He hadn't spent the windfall on new iron or land he couldn't afford. He'd saved it. Every penny. "Appreciate the offer, Mr. Abernathy," Silas said, his voice even. "But I think I'll stand pat. I'm doing all right as it is." Abernathy shook his head, a flicker of frustration in his eyes. "You're missing the boat, Silas. This is the opportunity of a lifetime. It won't last forever." "That's what I'm counting on," Silas said quietly. Abernathy left, and the community's verdict was sealed. Silas Blackwood wasn't just stubborn. He was a fool. He was a man who had a winning lottery ticket and refused to cash it. He became a cautionary tale the progressive farmers told their sons, an example of what happened when you let fear and old-fashioned thinking get in the way of ambition. Silas ignored them. He kept his own counsel and stuck to his father's wisdom. He farmed his land, paid his bills on time, and put his profits in the bank. He continued to maintain his own equipment, finding a deep satisfaction in the hum of a well-tuned engine and the straight, clean rows he left in his fields. He saw the frantic pace of his neighbors, the worry in their eyes, even as they boasted about their new purchases. He saw the lights on in their machine sheds late at night as they struggled to get new, complex equipment running, waiting on a dealer mechanic because they didn't know how to fix it themselves. One cool autumn evening in 1979, Silas was in his workshop, replacing a bearing on the auger of his Gleaner E combine. The harvest was done, the crops were in his bin, and the old machine had brought it all in without a single major breakdown. The small radio on his workbench was playing softly, tuned to a station out of Des Moines. The music ended, and the news came on. A man with a deep, serious voice was talking about the Federal Reserve, about a new chairman named Paul Volcker, who was determined to whip inflation. The announcer mentioned something called the prime interest rate. It had just been raised. Dramatically. Silas paused, a wrench in his hand. He turned up the volume. The announcer explained that in order to stop runaway inflation, the central bank was going to make borrowing money much more expensive. Interest rates on operating loans, mortgages, and equipment financing were expected to skyrocket in the coming months. A chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air crept down Silas's spine. He looked out the open door of his shed, across his harvested fields toward the distant glow of Rick Sterling's sprawling farmstead. He thought of the massive loans, the new machinery, the constant expansion, all of it built on the assumption that the good times would last forever and money would always be cheap. He shut off the radio. The silence of the workshop suddenly heavy. The boom had been loud and long. The bust, he suspected, would be just as epic, and he had a feeling it was just getting started. The first sign of trouble came not as a thunderclap, but as a whisper of dust. The spring of 1980 was unnervingly dry. The rains that should have been soaking the newly planted fields held back, leaving the sky a pale, indifferent blue. By June, the corn, which should have been shoulder-high, was stunted and gasping, its leaves curling inward during the heat of the day to protect what little moisture they held. Silas walked his fields in the evenings, the baked earth crunching under his boots, a knot of old, familiar worry tightening in his gut. He'd seen dry years before, but this one felt different. It felt mean. The heat wave that settled over the heartland that summer was brutal and relentless. Day after day, the sun beat down from a cloudless sky, searing the life from the crops. At the farmer's table, the talk of expansion and record profits died down, replaced by anxious murmurs about the forecast and the price of diesel for irrigation pumps, for those lucky enough to have them. Richard Sterling was not a man accustomed to worry. He'd built his empire on the assumption of good weather and better prices. When the drought took hold, his first response was to throw more money at the problem. He ran his massive center-pivot irrigation systems day and night, the diesel engines on the pumps gulping down fuel at an astonishing rate, but the pivots could only cover the flat, prime sections of his land. The rolling ground, the acres he'd paid top dollar for, were left to bake. Then came the second blow. In response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, President Carter declared a grain embargo. The primary customer for America's agricultural bounty was suddenly cut off. The market, already nervous about the drought-stunted yields, panicked. Corn prices, which had been the foundation of Sterling's financial castle, began to slide. $3 a bushel became $2.75, then $2.50. Every tick downwards on the Chicago Board of Trade was another stone pulled from his foundation. The first visible crack in Sterling's operation appeared in late July. His big Steiger Panther, the green monster that symbolized his dominance, sat idle for 3 days at the edge of a field, its massive duals looking like the feet of a dead giant. The gossip at the co-op was that its complex planetary final drive had failed. It wasn't something a farmer could fix with a set of wrenches and a pry bar. It required a specialized mechanic from the dealership 100 miles away, a man whose time was billed by the hour from the moment he left his shop. Silas saw the service truck parked in Sterling's yard for 2 days, a gleaming white symbol of an astronomical repair bill. Silas, meanwhile, was nursing his own crop through the drought. He didn't have irrigation, but he had something else, soil that hadn't been overworked. For years he'd practiced crop rotation and conservation tillage, methods the get big crowd had scoffed at as inefficient. His fields held the winter moisture better. His corn was suffering, there was no doubt, but it was surviving. His old Gleaner combine would have less to chew through come fall, but he knew that with no debt payments, even a small crop could mean survival. His operating costs for the year were a fraction of Sterling's. He'd paid for his seed and fertilizer with cash from last year's profits. His only major expense was fuel, and he used less of that than anyone. The tension in the community was becoming palpable. Mr. Abernathy, the banker, no longer lingered over coffee at the diner. He was seen making more and more trips out to the country in his Buick, his face grim. One afternoon, Silas was driving past Sterling's place and saw Abernathy's car parked in the lane. The two men were standing near the massive, silent grain bins. They weren't talking, they were arguing. Sterling's arms were waving, his face red with fury. Abernathy stood rigid, his hands in his pockets, shaking his head. The easy partnership forged in the boom years was fracturing under the strain of the bust. The money had stopped flowing, and the reckoning was beginning. That autumn, the harvest told the tale. Yields were down by half across the county. For farmers like Silas, it was a painful but survivable blow. For men like Rick Sterling, who had borrowed against the promise of 200 bushel corn, it was a catastrophe. The numbers simply didn't work. The income from his withered crop wouldn't even cover the interest on his operating loan for the year, let alone the payments on his land and machinery. And then the final hammer fell. Paul Volcker and the Federal Reserve, in their war on inflation, pushed the prime interest rate into the stratosphere. 8% loans, renewed annually, suddenly became 20% loans. It was a death sentence, and everyone knew it. The winter of 1981 descended like a shroud. The first foreclosure notices went up on the courthouse doors. The farm auctions began, grim affairs held in wind-swept, frozen farmyards. Neighbors stood in somber silence, their hats in their hands, as the auctioneer's rhythmic chant sent a lifetime of work and dreams to the highest bidder. These weren't retirement sales, they were funerals. Silas went to Tom Henderson's auction. He watched the John Deere 4430, the one that had passed him in the field with such confident speed years ago, sell for half of what Tom owed on it. He saw Tom's wife weeping quietly in the front seat of their car. He bought a set of old wrenches for $5, just so he could say he'd helped a little, and then he went home, his heart heavy. Richard Sterling fought it for as long as he could. He sold off a parcel of land at a loss to a corporate buyer from out of state. He tried to sell his Steiger, but the market was flooded with used equipment. No one was buying. His arrogance evaporated, replaced by a gaunt, hunted look. The polished loafers were replaced by scuffed work boots. He was seen working on his own equipment, his soft hands now covered in grease and cuts, a desperate, clumsy imitation of the work Silas had been doing all his life. But it was too late. The machines were too complex, the problems too big, and the debt too crushing. The end came in the spring of '82. A fleet of flatbed trucks and a representative from the bank arrived at Sterling's farm. They didn't argue. They simply started loading up the equipment. The 1466, the massive disc, the 12-row planter, all of it was hauled away. The symbols of his ambition were repossessed like common appliances. The last thing to go was the Lincoln Continental. Sterling stood on his porch and watched it disappear down the long gravel lane, his shoulders slumped in utter defeat. The Morton building, once a temple to modern agriculture, stood empty, a hollow monument to a broken dream. Through it all, Silas kept working. His routine didn't change. He rose before the sun, did his chores, and maintained his machinery. His old John Deere 40-on-10, the tractor Sterling had called a museum piece, fired up every morning. Its engine was a steady, reliable heartbeat in a world that was having a coronary. Because he had no debt, the low grain prices and high interest rates were like a storm raging outside his window. It was frightening to watch, but inside his house, he was safe and dry. He had enough savings to buy his seed and fuel, and enough food in the pantry to feed his family. His freedom, the one he had so stubbornly protected, was now his salvation. He didn't gloat. There was no satisfaction in watching his neighbors suffer, not even Sterling. He saw only tragedy, a preventable tragedy fueled by greed and bad advice. He saw good men, good farmers, lose everything because they had believed a promise that was too good to be true. He started getting quiet visitors in the evenings. Young farmers, the same ones who had smirked at him in the co-op, now came to his workshop, their faces etched with worry. "Silas," one of them asked, twisting a cap in his hands, "my dad's old 730. The hydraulics are weak. The dealer wants a fortune just to look at it. I was wondering, could you—" Silas would just nod, wipe his hands on a rag and say, "Pull it in the shed. Let's have a look." He shared his knowledge freely, teaching them how to diagnose a problem, how to find a used part, how to make do. He never once said, "I told you so." His actions spoke louder than any words could. He was no longer the fool on the hill. He was the survivor, the keeper of an older, quieter wisdom. The years ground on. The mid-80s arrived, and the worst of the crisis began to recede, leaving a landscape scarred with abandoned farmsteads and fields owned by insurance companies. The community was smaller, poorer, and humbler. The talk at the farmers' table was different now. It wasn't about getting bigger. It was about holding on. It was a Tuesday in the fall of 1985, a crisp, clear day with the smell of harvest in the air. Silas was at the diner for lunch, sitting in his usual booth. The place was quiet, only a few other farmers scattered around, their conversations muted. The screen door creaked open, and Richard Sterling walked in. He looked 10 years older. The confidence was gone, replaced by a permanent stoop in his shoulders. He'd lost the farm, everything but the original house and a few acres around it that were protected by homestead laws. He was working now as a hired hand for one of the big corporate farms that had bought up the foreclosed land, driving a tractor that wasn't his, on land that used to be his neighbor's. He didn't go to the big round table in the center. It was empty. He slid into a small booth in the back, alone, and kept his eyes on the menu, though everyone knew it by heart. At the counter, a couple of farmers were talking to the owner. "Can't believe it," one of them said, shaking his head. "The bank's auctioning off the old Miller place next week, Sterling's home place. Heard they're selling it all in one block. Only a corporation will be able to afford it." "Shame," the other one said. "That's been in the Miller family, then Sterling's, for 100 years. Now it'll just be farm number 704 on some spreadsheet in Chicago." From his booth in the back, Sterling flinched, a barely perceptible tightening of his shoulders. He didn't look up. He just stared harder at the menu, his face a mask of quiet shame. Silas watched him. He saw the man who had mocked him, who had called him a relic and a fool. But he also saw a broken man, a neighbor who had lost his way and paid a terrible price. He remembered the sting of Sterling's words all those years ago, but the memory had no heat in it anymore. It was just a cold, dead ash. He finished his beef stew, wiping the bowl clean with a piece of bread. He watched the waitress, a young woman whose father had lost his farm 2 years prior, drop the checks off at the tables. He saw the other farmers sigh as they reached for their wallets. He saw Sterling stare at his own check as if it were a bill he couldn't pay. Silas stood up. He walked not to his own table, but to the cash register at the front. He pulled out his old, cracked leather wallet, the same one he'd carried for 20 years. It was thick with cash, not because he was rich, but because he didn't trust banks any more than he had to. "I'll take care of all of them," he said quietly to the waitress, gesturing with his head to the occupied tables. He laid a handful of bills on the counter. "Everyone's lunch is on me today." The waitress looked at him, surprised. "All of them, Mr. Blackwood? Even?" She glanced toward Sterling's booth. "Everyone," Silas repeated, his voice firm but gentle. He counted out enough to cover all the checks and a generous tip besides. "Just tell them it's a good day for a harvest." He walked out without another word, the screen door creaking shut behind him. He didn't look back for their reactions. He didn't need their thanks. It wasn't about that. It was an act of quiet grace in a place that had seen too much hardship. The next Tuesday, Silas was at the county courthouse. The auction for the old Miller place, Rick Sterling's homestead, was being held on the front steps. A small crowd had gathered, a few local farmers who couldn't afford to bid, some curious townspeople, and a man in a crisp suit from a Chicago investment firm holding a briefcase. Rick Sterling was there too, standing at the back of the crowd, looking like a ghost at his own funeral. The auctioneer began his chant, his voice echoing off the stone facade of the courthouse. The bidding started, and the man in the suit was aggressive, his bids coming quickly and confidently. It seemed like a foregone conclusion. When the price reached a level that was far beyond any local farmer's reach, a pause fell over the crowd. "Do I have another bid?" the auctioneer called out. "Yes," a quiet voice said from the crowd. All heads turned. It was Silas Blackwood. He stood in his clean overalls, his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. The man in the suit looked at Silas with a dismissive smirk. The two of them went back and forth, the price climbing higher. The crowd watched in stunned silence. Silas's bids were calm and steady. He never hesitated. The smirk on the face of the man from Chicago slowly faded, replaced by a look of frustrated disbelief. Finally, the price reached a point where the corporate man furiously scribbled a note, shook his head, and stepped back. "Sold!" the auctioneer cried, his gavel falling with a sharp crack. "To Mr. Silas Blackwood." A ripple of applause and surprised murmurs went through the crowd. Silas simply nodded to the auctioneer and walked into the courthouse to sign the papers. He paid for the entire farm right there, with a cashier's check drawn from the credit union account Mr. Abernathy had never known about. Later that afternoon, Silas drove his old Ford pickup down the lane to the Miller place. He found Rick Sterling on the porch, packing the last of his personal belongings into a cardboard box. Sterling didn't look up as Silas approached. "Come to gloat, Blackwood," he said, his voice rough. "Come to watch them throw me off my own land?" "No," Silas said, stopping at the bottom of the steps. "I came to talk to you about your new landlord." Sterling finally looked up, his eyes filled with confusion. "What are you talking about?" "I bought the place," Silas said simply. The color drained from Sterling's face. You bought it? To plow it under? To finally prove you were right all along?" "I bought it because it's a good farm," Silas said, his voice even. "And good farms need good farmers. This place was your family's. It needs you. I was thinking, I need someone to run it for me. On shares, a 60-40 split. Your favor. You run it. You live here. You put your life back together. When you're back on your feet, maybe you can buy it back from me. For what I paid. No interest. Sterling stared at him, speechless. The hatred and shame in his eyes slowly gave way to a dawning, painful understanding. He saw not a rival, but a neighbor. He saw not vengeance, but a lifeline. He sank down onto the top step, put his head in his hands, and for the first time in years, Richard Sterling wept. Silas didn't stay to watch. He just turned and walked back to his truck, leaving the man alone with his grief and his unexpected, undeserved second chance. In the years that followed, Silas Blackwood became a quiet legend in the county. His farm never got much bigger, but it thrived. His old machinery kept running. The John Deere 4010, now a classic, still cultivated his corn. The Gleaner E still brought in his harvest. He was a living reminder of a different path, a testament to the idea that the race isn't always to the swift, but sometimes to the steady. One warm summer evening, years later, Silas was in his workshop with his grandson, a boy of 16 with grease on his hands and curiosity in his eyes. The boy was looking at the 4010, its green paint faded and worn, its tires cracked with age. "Grandpa," the boy asked, "why didn't you ever buy a new tractor? One with a cab and air conditioning. You could have afforded it." Silas picked up a wrench, its steel smooth and cool in his hand. He pointed to the tractor's engine. "You see this?" he said. "Every bolt, every hose, every wire. I know its story. When it's sick, I know how to make it well. When it's tired, I know how to make it strong. I can fix it right here, with my own 2 hands." He paused, looking from the tractor to the boy, his eyes filled with a deep, quiet love. "This land," he continued, gesturing out the open door to the fields bathed in the golden light of dusk. "And this iron in here, it's ours. It doesn't belong to a man in a bank. It's not a number on a piece of paper. It's real. And because it's ours, we're free. Don't you ever forget that, son. A man sleeps different at night, a whole lot better, when he knows the roof over his head and the ground under his feet are his own." He handed the wrench to the boy. "Now, let's get this valve cover tightened down. We've got hay to make in the morning." The boy took the wrench, his grip sure and strong, and as the sun set over the rolling hills of the heartland, the quiet clinking of steel on steel in the old machine shed was the sound of a lesson learned, a legacy passed, and a quiet victory that would last for generations.